はい、皆様。
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us despite your busy schedule. We will start the seminar on decarbonizing the steel industry, global approaches in Japan's challenges. I will serve as the moderator. I am Goto Eric, researcher of the Renewable Energy Institute. First of all, may I mention that this seminar is co-organized by the climate group Steel Zero and with the cooperation of Japan Climate Leaders Partnership and the Japan Climate Initiative. Iron and steel is indeed the foundation that supports today's lives. In our daily life, there is almost no day that we go without touching iron and steel. The buildings, including our homes, automobiles and railways that transport ourselves, smartphones in our hands, satellites flying in deep space. Iron and steel play an indispensable role in all aspects of our society. However, on the other hand, the iron and steel industry account for approximately 10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. In Japan, it accounts for 12%. And it has long been called the so-called hard-to-abate sector. However, more recently, steel making technological innovations have advanced rapidly, and the governments across the world are very proactively promoting the decarbonization of the industrial sectors. As the third largest steelmaker in the world, Japan is facing a huge responsibility and at the same time a critical opportunity to achieve net zero by 2050. The endeavors by Japan are attracting high levels of attention by the global community with keen expectations. Under this backdrop, this seminar will look at the situation across the world, share expertise with international experts about the current situation in Japan and the future challenges of Japan, and we hope this will be another momentum for all of us to think about the future vision of the iron and steel industry in earnest, together with the participants. It is also our sincere wish that it will lead to more dialogue and cooperation between the end users and the suppliers going forward in terms of policies and actions. The seminar is divided in 3 sessions. Session 1 will study the latest global developments in steel decarbonization, and experts from international research organizations and think tanks will brief us. Session 2 will look at the current situation of iron steel decarbonization in Japan and introduce efforts ongoing in Japan. The last will be the panel discussion, where we will go in depth about the possibility of the creation of demand for low-carbon steel, where Japanese businesses have the potential to take the lead. The seminar will be followed by a reception, which will be our networking opportunity, and therefore please do exchange opinions amongst the participants and deepen your debates. The co-representative of Japan Climate Initiative, Mr. Shigeo Kato, who was expected to join us in the panel, is unfortunately able to join us. Thank you for your understanding. The screen will display the Japanese language materials. Both Japanese and the English versions are available for the public on the website of our program. So, going on to session 1. Session 1 is about the latest global developments in the steel decarbonization. The speakers are Mr. Udo Witechka and Ms. Izan Choksi. Udo is active as an independent consultant specializing in steel industry decarbonization, and when he was with Agoro Industry, he was involved in the preparation of the report on 15 insights on the global steel transformation, which was translated into Japanese by our institute. Izan is the project lead of global green steel transition at the Agoro Industry and is deeply involved in the next generation of steel making technologies, technical and strategic support to the governments across the world. After each of the presentation, there will be a few minutes of Q&A moderated by the Senior Manager of the Renewable Energy Institute, Yuko Nishida, who is leading the research of the Decarbonizer Steel at the Institute. Now, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this nice introduction. My name is Vito Viteka, and I will be holding the first part of the presentation, and then later on, Isan Choksi from Agora Industry will do the second part. And the presentation is titled Achieving Climate Neutral Steel by 2050, How the Steel Sector Can Shift from Coal-Based to Clean Production. It's a project that we have conducted together in the last couple of months, and today I'm very happy to present the findings to you. Next slide, please. You see here a brief look over the agenda that we will cover in the next 20 minutes or so. And I will jump right in to the first point, 2030 steel emissions projections. Next slide, please. And again, next slide. Thank you. So here, I think when it comes to 2030 and the outlook to 2030, something very important to note is that we think that we might already be beyond peak emissions in the steel sector. And one big question is, looking forward, where do we go from here? What you're seeing here on this slide is, on the one hand, like the steel production over the years. You can see that when we look at the last years, there is the highest steel production in 2021. So far, that has been the peak. And since then, it's been declining. This is also mainly due to the structural decline of steel demand in China. And then you see the pink line, which is the emissions, and you can also see that the peak so far has been in 2021. So the question that we then ask is this decline sustainable, or what will be the main drivers for change in the years to come? Next slide, please. And when we asked ourselves this question, where could we land by 2030 in terms of emissions of the steel sector? We thought that there are three important factors that will determine where we land. And of course, a lot is assumption-driven, as with any outlook, but we still think this is important to kind of give a little bit of direction. And the first important factor that will determine where we land is the activity change in coal-based production. So on the one hand, we have some countries and regions that are still building new coal-based steel production facilities, mainly India and Southeast Asia at the moment. And at the same time, we are also seeing like capacity shutdown. We're seeing the issue of overcapacity in China, and we're expecting that China will, in the next year, significantly reduce some of its coal-based production. So you can see here that they, in very grand terms, might be balancing each other out. What's happening in India, Southeast Asia on the one hand, and China on the other hand. And then when it comes to the climate levers, there is the switch from blast furnace-based steel to secondary steel. That is the biggest climate lever until 2030. But also, as a third lever, the switch to low-carbon iron. So switching from blast furnaces to various DRI-based steelmaking routes that are operated either with natural gas or hydrogen or a mix of the two. In total, we foresee 5% emission reductions. Next slide, please. However, it becomes clear that if we want to reach net zero by 2050, we need a significant acceleration of the global steel transition, because if we only do 5% until 2030, we will have to do over 90% to reach net zero by 2050. It's important that the foundations for this acceleration are laid now. Now, if we ask the question how to accelerate the global steel transition, one is we have to unlock scrap-based steel production. A second important factor is we need to build up low-carbon iron production. And a third important factor is the policy framework, which policies are required to unlock renewables and low-carbon hydrogen for steel, as well as developing offtake markets for green steel. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the key takeaways of this first part, we see that the global steel sector is at or close to peak CO2 emissions. However, achieving our climate neutrality targets requires a significant acceleration of the global steel transition. With regards to 2030, we see the steel sector on a trajectory for around 5% emissions reductions compared to 2020 levels. Next slide, please. I come to the next part, which is next generation steelmaking. Next slide, please. So when we're looking across the landscape of like all the different net zero roadmaps and studies in the steel sector, we actually see that there's a broad consensus emerging that scrap-based steel can supply around 40 to 50% of near zero emission steel by 2050. However, this also means that the rest needs to be low carbon primary steel. You can see our scenarios here. So on the left-hand side, you see, for example, the green in the bottom, which is scrap-based EAF, and you can see how the share from scrap-based EAF, basically from today, a little bit more than 20%, or in 2020, will rise in this scenario to something between 40 to 50%. And we see this result in many studies, also from other research institutions. But it's important that this basically means clean primary steel production will have to deliver at least 50% of production by 2050. You see that on the right-hand side. And this translates into more than 1,000 million tons of production. So the big question is, which technologies can help to deliver that? Next slide, please. When this question is asked to steelmakers, nowadays, you can see that they have a very clear answer. There are no signs currently that CCS on the BF-BOF route will play a major role in the transition to net zero. It looks very likely that DRI will be the pacemaker of the steel transition. So what you see here is the 2030 pipeline of low carbon steel projects. And you see that there are around 89 million tons of direct reduced iron projects in the pipeline. And there is currently only one project globally at the time when we did the study that was still looking into post-combustion CCS on BF-BOF. So the steelmakers have shown clear signs where the direction of travel is going to go. Next slide, please. Now, when we zoom out and ask the question about where are we standing globally with the transition, one interesting thing to see is that the transition to low carbon steel is gaining momentum, and it's also becoming truly global with projects now on all 5 continents. And it is something that has not been the case. For example, just 2 or 3 years ago, it was mainly focused on Europe, with maybe some projects in other countries, but you can now really see the projects on each continent emerging, and that is a good news. Next slide, please. The other thing that we notice is that the number of projects that has reached at least FID stage has increased significantly compared to 2 years ago. You see that on the left-hand side, basically from 18 million tons to something like 45 million tons. However, when we zoom into the projects that have reached FID, only a small number of them is using hydrogen DRI purely. That's around 6 million tons for 2030. All others use some kind of like either mixture between natural gas and hydrogen DRI or some form of natural gas DRI. Next slide, please. So for 2030, when we ask the question, what do we think is realistic in terms of DRI capacity, we think that we will see between 45 to 68 million tons of new DRI capacity coming online by 2030. But as I said before, not all of them will use clean hydrogen by 2030. We see a realistic hydrogen potential of these projects of between 2.7 million tons of hydrogen in a lower case scenario and 4.2 million tons of hydrogen used by the steel industry in a higher case scenario. Next slide, please. Now, another important factor is the question of the regional breakdown. And here, what we can also clearly see by looking at the different low carbon steel projects, that the EU, but also MENA, Middle East and North Africa, can lead in DRI or HBI production. And it will be very important to boost low carbon hydrogen supply, to have more projects really using hydrogen instead of only natural gas. Next slide, please. Why do I say that? Because it's pretty clear that unabated natural gas DRI can deliver emission reductions of up to 50% of emissions compared to the blast furnace BOF route. But it's also clear that 50% is not enough. We cannot stop at a halfway transition. We have to take steps to really approach close to zero emissions in the steel sector, and unabated natural gas DRI is only 50% of the way there. Next slide, please. So as a key takeaway from this part, as of today, hydrogen-based direct reduced iron will be the main technology pathway for climate-neutral primary steel production. However, hydrogen uptake is at risk without clear policy signals to allow iron and steel makers to fully transition to hydrogen-based steelmaking. Next slide, please. I will now go to the next part and speak about how to unlock hydrogen and building out renewables. Next slide, please. This is something quite obvious that will not surprise anyone in the room, but it's the starting point, and it's important to emphasize this again and again. Decarbonizing steel will require huge new renewable resources to be built out. You see on the left-hand side the significant increase of hydrogen consumption of a net zero steel sector. These are numbers from the IEA. And on the right-hand side, you see that also electricity consumption of the steel sector will double. So it's really important that there's a rapid build-out of renewables, of the infrastructure of renewables, of hydrogen, of the infrastructure of hydrogen, and of course of policy signals and that support building up renewables, hydrogen, and the respective infrastructure. Next slide, please. Now, when we look at the low carbon hydrogen project pipeline for 2030, something interesting to see is that we're not lacking announcements. We see here like 26 million tons of low carbon hydrogen projects in the pipeline. However, we're really lacking FIDs at the moment. And one important question to ask is, why is that the case? And we think there are three reasons to be mentioned. The first one is that globally, low carbon hydrogen production costs are higher than most studies previously expected 2 years ago. A second important factor is that transporting hydrogen via ship adds a significant amount of cost, which makes interregional hydrogen trade more costly. unless the hydrogen is transported as what we call embodied hydrogen. In the case of the steel industry, that would be HBI. And then the third reason is that the policy framework to incentivize FIDs for low carbon hydrogen is not fully fit for purpose yet. Next slide, please. The steel industry can play a really important role in unlocking hydrogen because the steel industry offtakes by 2030 could help to unlock around 2.7 million tons of low carbon hydrogen FIDs, which would add really significantly more hydrogen and help to unlock the FIDs if all the plants in the steel industry planning to use it transition fully to hydrogen by 2030. Next slide, please. So the key takeaway from this part is that climate neutral steel requires reliable access to affordable renewable electricity, clean hydrogen, and supporting infrastructure. By prioritizing steel as a key hydrogen offtake sector, the right policy incentives can help to unlock more FIDs for low carbon hydrogen projects. Next slide, please. Now I come to the last part of my presentation, bottlenecks in the DRI supply chain. Next slide, yeah. When we ask this question of how do we get to net zero by 2050, looking at the clean technologies for primary steelmaking, what we see is that as things currently stand, there is no credible pathway to net zero by 2050 without ramping up the yearly DRI capacity additions to around 50 million tons DRI per year after 2030. Why is that? Because as I've shown before, most net zero 2050 scenarios show that at least 1,000 million tons of clean primary steel will be required. If we then ask ourselves the question, okay, what technologies can help to deliver and contribute to those 1,000 million tons of clean primary steel by 2050, we have seen that the role of CCS on the BF-BOF route is really highly questionable, with each steel company that is kind of like looking into it in the end and deciding for the DRI-based routes. There are quite promising direct electrification technologies in development, but they're not commercially ready yet, so they can play a role, but from today's perspective, this is also uncertain. So what we can say from today's perspective is that DRI will need to carry the bulk of the transition. And if we really want to aim for those 1,000 million tons of clean primary steel by 2050, we have to start to build out DRI at much higher rates than what we have seen in the past, but we also see an acceleration. So basically, since 2015, we have already increased the speed when we look at the 5-year period from 2026 to 2030, 3 times, but a further acceleration of this is needed. Next slide, please. Another bottleneck or challenge that is often mentioned is high-grade iron ore. And here there are also positive news because since 2023, there are new pilot and demonstration projects that make lower grade iron ore accessible for the DRI route. So basically, the discussion 2-3 years ago was, oh, we may have only 3% of the iron ore that has an iron content above 66% that is suitable for DRI-based steelmaking in DRI EAFs. And we have a number of innovations happening that are basically also making lower grade iron ore accessible for DRI-based steelmaking routes. And all in all, this is a very positive development. Next slide, please. And I hand over, not yet. The key takeaway from this part is that the large-scale global uptake of DRI-based steelmaking requires a concerted, coordinated effort across the entire technology supply chain, from technology providers and engineering firms to steelmakers and investors. to rapidly expand annual DRI construction capacity and deployment to around 50 million tons a year. And now I'm handing over to Isan for the part on policy mix and international collaborations. Thank you.
Hi there. Thanks so much, Vito, for starting us off and doing such a great beginning to the presentation. So I'm just going to do a few slides on the policy mix and the international collaboration, because what we wanted to do was to set up here a very clear picture of where we see steel decarbonisation going in terms of technologies and also emissions, and where we see the bottlenecks potentially being. And the reason we wanted to do this was to provide the analytical basis on which we could base a policy mix, and on which we could base also our advice on international collaboration that will be needed. So next slide, please. So as a result of that, we came up with this policy mix, which is looking at the entire value chain and trying to understand what a smart policy mix would look like for steel decarbonisation. So firstly, at the upstream level, on the energy and infrastructure level, we are advocating for support for clean energy, raw material supply, and carbon pricing as well, as a basis for pushing steel companies to invest in clean technologies. So what would that mean? It means planning and financing of renewables, H2 and infrastructure. So that would be feed-in tariffs, corporate PPAs, investment support, and CFDs, so carbon contracts for difference or contracts for difference. We also see the need for harmonized criteria and standards for those inputs of hydrogen and biomass as well, if biomass is going to be used. At the midstream level, ramping up supply, so i.e. ramping up the projects for DRI, would need concerted support for climate-friendly production processes. So that means project support and de-risking for clean steel investment and operating costs. Again, carbon contracts for difference or contracts for difference, subsidies and tax credits for those companies making the large capital investments in new DRI projects with accompanying H2. And R&D and RD&D and funding is something that we see as necessary, because this is still a relatively new technology in the sense that it has never been done with 100% hydrogen before. It is a relatively old technology in the sense that it's over a half a century old. So around 50 years worth of DRI production has been going on mostly in the MENA region. Largest DRI producer in the world is Iran. And then MENA region has been leaning into DRI over the last decades as a result of their copious amounts of access to natural gas. So we do see RD&D funding as being necessary to really understand the effect that 100% H2 has on this technology. Then moving downstream, scaling demand, i.e. the market pull factors and standards, which I know you'll be talking about later in this conference. We see the absolute basis for that, the foundational keystone of that being harmonized standards and labeling and certification for green steel, so that buyers are able to know exactly what they're buying and have confidence in it. Embodied carbon limits and minimum green steel content regulations are more a pull factor, so ensuring that the market is created for those green steel products. And green public procurement and green premium price support can be done on a government level in order to provide stability of demand, but also provide the technical skill share of procurement officers being able to understand exactly what green steel is and how to procure it correctly. Underneath all of this are the enablers: international finance, policy coordination, trade and technology partnerships, and skilling and reskilling of workers who will be undergoing a large transition in their sector. The next slide, please. So this is a slide looking at international cooperation and making steel decarbonisation easier to achieve. What we wanted to understand here was looking at strategic partnerships as being a way to push forward one aspect specifically, which is the green iron trade. So trying to really think about how important strategic partnerships can be in creating a trade between a different part of the supply chain that currently exists. Next slide, please. So we do understand that a policy mix along the entire value chain will also need a concerted amount of international action along the entire value chain as well, as steel is a globally traded commodity and it is also a global supply chain as well. So we're not just putting the onus on just steel makers and renewables developers and steel associations in order to make this change. We also understand that they will need to be supported by a policy framework by their national governments and regulators, multilateral bodies like the World Bank and UN bodies, think tanks and researchers. We can provide road mapping exercises and policy mixes and also technology advice, as well as certification bodies for those standards which make up the foundation keystone of any lead market policy. Underneath it all, you will need community participation and labour organisation participation as well, because this is going to be a large transition for the labour market of the steel industry. So labour organisations, trade organisations, as well as environmental and community organisations that will be co-located with those blast furnaces and integrated steel routes, and in the future towards those iron-making installations with DRI and H2. Underneath it all is the technology providers and also the financial institutions that are going to make it possible through equity investments and commercial debt provision. And underneath that, we have written also export credit agencies as being a part of this. Export credit agencies, because we do see a role, as I said, in green iron trade, and export credit agencies can be used to de-risk investments from, for instance, Western investors or investors in countries that will find it hard to provide all of their primary steel production, like in places like Central and Eastern Europe, as well as potentially even Japan and South Korea, that will struggle to get access to the amounts of hydrogen that they will need in order to decarbonize all of their primary steel. Next slide, please. So we turned this into a call to action for COP and managed to get 8 companies to sign onto that call to action. Please, next slide, please. And we wanted it to be an opportunity for steel companies to go to their governments and ask for action, clear action on steel decarbonisation. So this call to action is based on this paper as being essentially a feasibility study for steel decarbonisation. What we're trying to say is it can be done. And we do have the technologies that are necessary to do that within the timeframes that we imagine are correct for 1.5 degrees warming. But in order to do that, we need a clear signal and also policy support from governments. So we see iron and steel as being a lead industry for heavy industry decarbonisation. Second point is we need to accelerate the deployment of clean primary steel technologies. We're really putting our thumb on the scales of H2-based DRI as being the main technology pathway or the main heavy lifter for the technology pathway for steel decarbonisation by 2050. In order to do that in a fully decarbonised way, we're going to have to secure large amounts of renewable energy and green hydrogen supply to make it a full transition rather than a halfway transition, which is gas-based. Strengthening governance and trade frameworks across the value chain is going to be needed as a result of the fact that this is a global value chain and needs to be dealt with governance and trade frameworks across it. And then lastly, calling for domestic governments to support their own steel companies with an enabling regulatory environment to support the iron and steel value chain. Measures that would accelerate investment, reduce risk, and stimulate demand are needed to create a viable business case for climate neutral steel and to close the cost gap between coal-based steel and the green steel of the future. Thanks very much. Next slide.
Thank you very much for great presentation, Vito and Izan. Thank you so much. So from myself,
If I may, I would like to ask a few questions, starting with Vito. Recently, the hydrogen cost is rising all of a sudden, and there are difficulties with hydrogen project like delays. We hear such media news in Japan, and there are delays or cessation in low carbon steel projects as well, and therefore the progress of decarbonization seems to be becoming even more uncertain. However, as I listen to your presentation, even during 2024 to 2025, the DRI, direct reduction iron, new projects have been announced. You mentioned about the MENA, Middle East and North Africa, that there are a positive progress in the projects. And there are projects that are under construction or close to operation start. So those are major positive changes, and I feel assured. Having said that, a difficult environment will continue. However, as you have briefed us, in Japan, decarbonization projects, in particular hydrogen-based DRI, to do that in Japan at the moment, DRI projects outside of Japan are progressing, but in the case of using gas, it is only halfway. And in order to go to more hydrogen-based, there must be policy signaling, as you mentioned. And in countries outside of Japan, what are the policies, what are the drivers that could be a positive signal for Japan? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think what we have been seeing over the last 2 to 3 years is recalibration of DRI projects. 3 to 4 years ago, DRI projects were mainly driven by climate policies and by a logic of transforming integrated BF-BOF steelworks by doing that on-site with a DRI plant. And the main driver for this development 2 to 3 years ago was the EU. And we are now seeing a shift that DRI projects are increasingly being built where the hydrogen of the future will also be cheap and competitive. So we have seen the MENA region. Australia has some very promising developments. We have seen the first green iron plant in Namibia, basically for Africa, and also some promising initiatives in Brazil. So this in itself is a good development. And what can help this development is, of course, the demand for this green iron from countries that can use that. So the question is like, how can we build up that demand? And when it comes to the policies that you asked about, it is along the lines of the policy mix that Izan has also shared. But I think the most important element is some form of a carbon price to basically increase the price on CO2 incentive, CO2 intensive production to kind of create an incentive to switch to lower carbon technologies. And then on the other side, green lead markets with clear demand signals for near zero emissions-based steel. This could be in the automotive sector, but it could also be the government saying we want to use green steel for, let's say, public transport projects or for the build out of renewables. And of course, for all of this, green steel standards will play an important role. As Isan said, that the buyers know what they are getting.
Thank you very much. And one question also to Izan, if I may. And thank you for that very comprehensive policy list. And going forward, I hope that Japan's policies will follow, and we would like to check Japan's policies by learning from your recommendation. And the final page was call to action. COP30. It was the event where this was issued. And what was the reaction, if I may ask?
Hi there. Yes, so the call to action ended up being a group of 8 different companies who signed up to our 5 main points. So those companies were from across 5 continents, and they also represented companies across the entire value chain, from iron mining companies to DRI producers. And it was mainly companies, I have to say, that had already started investing in DRI technology. So it wasn't so, it wasn't difficult for them to imagine that this would be the main heavy lifter for steel decarbonization up until 2050. So that went really well. We have been advertising it mainly on LinkedIn, but also throughout our COP engagements at events. we've found that policymakers have been very responsive to this, and they understand as well, or they what they liked about it a lot is that we also provided some information on the policy mix along the entire value chain, which I think is sometimes hard to grasp, that it's not going to be just the pull factor of demand lead market policies that will get us there. It won't be just a carbon price that will get us there, but equally you cannot do it without either. And you're also going to need to understand what it takes for a company to decarbonize in terms of capital costs and also potential short-term and mid-term operational costs, with higher costs of that input being green hydrogen. So that project support for the capital costs and also project support potentially for operational costs. So seeing that all together, I think, has been really helpful for policymakers to imagine the kinds of international collaboration, but also the kinds of domestic policy support that they will need. And at a COP where industry decarbonisation is playing a larger than normal role, this has been a very welcomed intervention into showing that one of the supposedly, historically speaking, hardest to abate sectors can be abated, and also can be abated in time for the climate goals that we all signed up to back in 2015 at the Paris Convention.
はい、ウィドさん、イザンさん、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much to Wido and Izan. And going on to the next presentation.
So it is Amy Jackson. So about the standard setting of a low emission industry, there will be some trends to be introduced. Responsible steel is aiming to realize responsible production of steel, and it is a multi-stakeholder initiative. So now over to you, Amy-san, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having us to speak at your conference today. My name is Amy. I am the Director of Programs at Responsible Steel. So our team looks after all the technical components of Responsible Steel, including our production standard, which we'll hear more about today, and our assurance program, our chain of custody, claims, etc. So the technical side. Next slide, please. So I was asked to share our thoughts on how standards can help to drive decarbonization in the steel industry. So I'll first share an introduction to Responsible Steel, our organization. Then I'll talk about the importance of standards in general in progressing action on sustainability. And of course, here we're discussing the decarbonization of the steel industry. And then I'll specifically talk about the role of standards in progressing decarbonization policies. We made an exciting announcement last week about interoperability. So I'll share a little bit about the recent work we've been doing to harmonize and create interoperability between different steel sustainability initiatives. Next slide. So first, a little bit more about Responsible Steel. So while we are a standard system, we see ourselves and we behave as a multi-stakeholder platform. So this means we're more than just a standard. So essential to our identity is that we bring different groups together, which helps to build trust, consensus, and credibility. So this diagram shows the stakeholders that we engage with, and we have a membership approach where we have members from all different stakeholder types. When we develop our standards, this is done transparently and publicly, and anyone can submit their comments, any stakeholder from anywhere in the world. So you can see we bring together companies from throughout the steel value chain, investors, civil society, policymakers, and more. Next slide, please. So here's a snapshot of our current members. You can see they're getting difficult to fit on one slide, but like everything we do, everything is available on our website. So you can see all of our members there. So our website is responsiblesteel.org. Next slide, please. So central to everything that we do is our production standard. So this is the list here of the 13 principles, which are supported by 61 criteria, that steelmaking sites need to comply with to become responsible steel certified. So today we are specifically talking at this conference about decarbonization, which is covered by our Principle 10. Across the responsible steel standard, excuse me, we cover all of the environmental, social, and governance principles that must be considered when trying to assess what makes steel production responsible. So this is what makes us unique in this landscape. And we have heard that it is valued by users of our system to know that the wider environmental and social criteria have been considered when receiving steel from a site that has a responsible steel certificate. It is also managed by strong governance principles, which helps with risk management for users of the steel and investors. This QR code will take you to our production standard if you wish to read it in more detail, currently in English. Next slide, please. So, as well as the breadth of the standard, we also take a holistic approach to the implementation of our whole system. So we don't just set the standard in collaboration with our stakeholders, we also run the assurance program, we manage claims about our system, and we continue to learn and improve through data collection and stakeholder feedback. So this system level approach is another part of what makes us unique and is part of being aligned with the ICL Code of Good Practice for Voluntary Sustainability Systems. So ICL is a membership organization that leads the way in ensuring the credibility and effectiveness of voluntary sustainability systems. Here you can see that it says standards. So we have our production standard for the steel site. We also have a chain of custody standard for the traceability of steel through certified supply chains. Next slide. So this is the last slide on responsible steel, which shows our reach. You can see we have 90 certified sites, which represent approximately 140 million metric tons of crude steel and over 256,000 workers across 5 continents. We would, of course, love to see steelmakers based in Japan join us in the future as well. Next slide. So next we'll talk about how standards can help in decarbonizing the steel industry. And thank you, Shui-san, for highlighting the importance of standards in this effort. Next slide, please. So as we have heard, steel contributes roughly 10% of global energy emissions. The first part of tackling a problem is being able to understand and measure it. So we need credible, comparable data. Credible standards help to measure emissions on a consistent basis and to verify performance. So they also help define low emission steel. When we reach agreement on what this is, we can make coordinated efforts to achieve all of this. This enables alignment across all the important actors: producers, auditors, investors, buyers, and policymakers. Standards help by providing decision-ready information, especially when all of these actors and the standards coordinate. Essential for measuring and defining, part of the reason this is important for defining credibly defining responsible steel or low carbon steel is that depending on the methodologies used, the emissions calculations can vary by up to 30%. So it's very difficult to tackle a problem when it is really hard to get a sense of what it is that you're dealing with. So next slide, please. So to look at this in a bit more detail, if we have the credible standards, they enable coordinated action. So specifically for different stakeholders, we can see buyers that are committed to decarbonization can demand lower emission steel. And if they're using credible standards, they can be confident that they are receiving it, not just from the definition perspective, but from the assurance perspective. So that there is independent verification that it's happening. Regulators can refer to standards to support the implementation of policies, both in defining expectations and, like the buyers, relying on the independent assurance of the compliance that is offered. So investors can review decarbonization plans and understand the transition finance needed to achieve these, as well as tracking progress of their investments over time. There can be ESG-linked loans and financing that will allow the measurement of the delivery of those loans. Steelmakers, through all of this, with all of these drivers, this means that steelmakers are then incentivized to continuously improve over time and allows them to benchmark their improvements against clear performance thresholds, again, using consistent methodologies for measuring those. Next slide, please. So looking specifically at policy development and emphasizing some of the points already made, standards help with progressing decarbonization policy development by providing common definitions of low emission steel, which can support international interoperability and reduce trade friction. It can help be the source for harmonized, verified greenhouse gas data to enable implementation of decarbonization policies like CBAM, digital product passports, and to support green public procurement. They can allow that data can be relied upon due to credible third-party assurance of it. So I mentioned that we run the assurance program at Responsible Steel. What we do is we set the rules for assurance, but the assurance of the sites is actually conducted by independent third-party certification bodies and auditors. So we also see that if all regulations can refer to one recognized framework, or where they are interoperable, this can reduce regulatory fragmentation and allow efforts to focus on the actual decarbonization of the industry. The clear definitions also help enable the setting and implementation of demand-side policies, particularly because of that benchmarking ability to track progress. And finally, we can align industry transition plans with policy timelines through a neutral, multi-stakeholder agreed framework. Next slide. So this just shows an example of bringing stakeholders together to work on this topic. So this was a roundtable that we convened in Brussels last month with a variety of stakeholders, including steelmakers, civil society, and of course in Brussels, policymakers. We invited attendees to discuss what was essential to bring together to decarbonize the steel industry. And it was recognized as a really valuable platform for convening. So we will shortly publish the outcomes of this and an additional convening that we held in Delhi in India last month in a policy paper that will be available by the end of the year. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned at the beginning, one area that we must be aware of is that there are already several standards for steel decarbonization. So interoperability and ultimately harmonization must be embraced. Next slide, please. So you're probably familiar with many of these logos. This slide shows a sample of both the growing number of national and voluntary standards for steel decarbonization, as well as the green steel brands that are independently developed by steel companies. Excuse me. As mentioned earlier, the challenge with the different standards and different measures, many of you will be very familiar with, in terms of burden on the steelmaker, costs of auditing, difficulty to align in policies. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the actual results can vary quite significantly in terms of measuring emissions, up to 30%, some studies say, which makes tracking progress incredibly difficult. Next slide, please. So these regional frameworks continue to emerge, and some harmonization is being seen. For example, the scrap variable scale has been adopted as the framework by most regional standards and backed by the stakeholders that support them. In the steel sector, there is a specific forum for ensuring credibility and moving towards alignment in what's called the Steel Standards Principles, which now has 65 signatories and has continued to grow from its launch in November 2023, COP28. There is a recognized opportunity to pursue interoperability and harmonization for GHG measurement and decarbonization. It's worth just highlighting that responsible steel is still the only steel sector standard that considers the breadth of ESG issues in the steel sector. But we very much recognize the significant efforts in the landscape on decarbonization, and hence are working very hard on interoperability here of these greenhouse gas standards. Next slide. For interoperability, which means the ability to exchange between the different standards, in order for it to be effective and trusted, as described in the uses of standards previously, it must be done credibly. So we have developed a framework for credible interoperability. And here, this outlines the key elements that must be in place for this to happen. So these are in two main groups. On the technical side, with developing a conversion tool, which is the literal calculation that allows the calculation between the two standards, and determining the accounting overlaps and gaps, as well as how the conversion will be assured. So who is checking that that conversion is being done well, and what claims can be made about that conversion. Underpinning all of this, or overseeing all of this, is various governance requirements, including the oversight of that conversion. So I mentioned we have independent oversight of our assurance program, so we see it operating in the same way. The day-to-day operations and ways of working. Essential here is how data is managed, where it's stored, who owns it. So being really clear on that when approaching an interoperability agreement, as well as agreements on resourcing all of this work, both people and direct financial resources. So interoperability between standards is not just a conversion tool that anyone can run numbers through. We see it needs to be overseen by credible processes and underpinned by transparency, robustness, and mutual agreement on each of these components as recorded in the governance agreements. So we've published this framework last week. It's now available on our website with additional supporting detail. We very much welcome your feedback on it and encourage you to have a look. Next slide, please. So to this end of agreeing the governance of interoperability, we were very excited to announce at COP last week that we have signed 2 memorandums of understanding with the Chinese Iron and Steel Association, CISA, and the Brussels-based Low Emission Steel Standard, LESS, to work together to develop interoperability between the C2F standard and the Responsible Steel Standard, and the LESS standard and the Responsible Steel Standard. We are now working on further developing the technical and governance components of the interoperability framework that I described in the previous slide. So together with the LESS and CISA and Responsible Steel, this announcement of these 2 MOUs, Memorandums of Understanding, cover nearly 60% of the global steel sector, which is very exciting news. We're very aware that EPDs are commonly used for calculations in the steel sector. So we've also been working on EPD PCF-based conversion to better improve the utility of our decarbonization progress levels for downstream buyers. EPDs focus at product level, whereas the responsible steel standard is for site level. But we are aiming to understand what additional data points are needed for conversion and the materiality of each. Ultimately, this could lead to recommendations for improvements in EPDs, which could help buyers by disclosing the decarbonization progress levels of their EPDs. Responsible steel has a decarbonization scale that includes decarbonization progress levels so that it is easy to point to the level of decarbonization of the steel site. And so the idea would be to help with the visibility there of how the EPDs relate to those. Next slide, please. So just in conclusion, hopefully that's helped to show how credible multi-stakeholder standard systems, when implemented well and in collaboration with peer systems, can help to meet the growing need for agreed definitions of low emission steel and to help ensure that buyers, investors, and policymakers are enabled to drive decarbonization, making this a reality in the market. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Next slide, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Amy, for your presentation. Responsible steel is what I have been following, and there is as many as 90 certified sites. You are very successful, and I am very impressed. What I thought was most important is harmonization, that is, intra-standard harmonization or consistency or compatibility and interoperability. Indeed, I think these are extremely important. Related to this, from some time ago within Europe, there were RSS movement. I was aware about the movement in EU, but now you are working with China. And that is the big direction. And EDP, the EPD declaration will also work in tandem to ensure interoperability. You mentioned about other frameworks and including China. And within EU, in terms of policy direction to ensure interoperability, is that because of the policy direction of the EU itself?
I'm not sure I totally understood the question. Is it that policy drivers are leading us to work on interoperability?
That's it.
In part, yes. I think that the focus that we have had on interoperability comes back to some of the points in the presentation about the importance of comparable standards, and the reason that we are focusing on interoperability is to enable our ability to be useful to policymakers by ensuring that the ability to convert between different standard systems is enabled. So this will help policymakers to refer to decarbonization progress levels or emissions intensity and be confident that they are measuring them consistently globally. It also helps to ensure that that data is independently verified and so can be relied upon, particularly when you're looking at, for example, putting tariffs on or calculating emissions-based costs. So yes, we see that the comparability, but underpinned by that strong relationship between the standard systems and the agreements of the comparability and the conversion is really important to help support policy development.
Also in Japan, EPD is widely utilized, and therefore interoperability is very important, and higher interoperability is what we look forward to. So I sincerely hope that your activities will continue. Thank you very much for your contribution. Thank you very much to Amy.
Thank you very much, Amy. From now on, we'd like to move on to report 3 of session 1. So the final presentation will be by Samin Khan, Senior Manager of Steel of Climate Group. So Climate Group is accelerating the net zero conversion or transition of a steel industry, gathering ambitious businesses, and it is leading a global initiative called Steel Zero to issue a powerful market signal. So it is providing support for net zero steel procurement in the global steel value chain, and also in collaboration with international organizations, multinational groups, think tanks, NGOs, and governments. It is setting standards for net zero steel, and it is participating in various working groups and forums. So today we try to invite Mr. Samin Khan, excuse me. So she's leading a Steel Zero project. So the latest examples of demand side will be introduced, and Samin-san participated in revision, which is organized by us in March this year, and has accumulated proactive dialogues with the demand side companies of Japan. Over to you, Samin-san.
Thank you very much for inviting me to Japan again and having the opportunity to address such a wonderful crowd. And I really appreciate the presentations that we've had before me from Vito and Isan at Agora and Amy at Responsible Steel. They have really set the stage for me to now share about how Steel Zero is empowering demand-side leadership in the net zero steel transition. First, I would like to very, very briefly introduce Climate Group. Most of you would already be familiar with Climate Group, and we are an international non-profit organization founded in 2004, and we have a global presence. I myself am based in London. Our goal is to create a world of net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and our mission is to drive climate action fast. We do this by building and using our core networks of over 1,000 global businesses and governments, of which 700 businesses and 170 governments have made climate action commitments through our programs, such as RE100, EV100, the newly rebranded Smart Energy Coalition, which was previously EP100, and Steel Zero, one of our heavy industry initiatives. So as one of our key Climate Group programs, Steel Zero is a global initiative in partnership with Responsible Steel, who we have heard from today. And we bring together leading organizations to achieve our mission to speed up the transition to a net zero steel industry. Steel Zero was the first to create a quantitative global definition for low embodied carbon steel when we were initiated in 2020, and this is how we started to shape the market. However, in the last few years, with the emergence and update of the responsible steel standards and the decarbonization progress levels, we have, of course, also played our role in aligning with science-based, credible definitions that have been introduced. And so currently, the lower emission steel definition that we use in the Steel Zero framework is aligned with responsible steel. To then implement and achieve our goal, which is a market for 100% net zero steel by 2050, we have developed this commitment framework where buyers voluntarily commit to buying at least 50% of their purchases as lower emission steel by 2030. Our unique role here is as a global multiplier. So we are laying the foundations and scaling the mass market procurement of lower emission steel. And through the strength of our members' commitments, we are transforming the market by using their collective buying power and influence to send clear messages to steelmakers, to policymakers, and investors to speed up the wide-scale production of net zero steel. So why do we work with the demand side? And why is it necessary in supporting steel decarbonization? Of course, we've heard in the previous presentation that it's a whole range of stakeholders that need to come together to really drive this market forward. And our specialty is working with the demand side to then create those market pull factors with policymakers and industry as well. Working with demand side is important because, firstly, we need to forecast the demand to create and shape the market. Through the Steel Zero commitment to buy lower emission and ultimately net zero steel, companies are evidencing what this clear demand is. At present, we have over 40 global companies that have made this commitment from a wide range of sectors, including construction, shipping, automotive, renewable energy infrastructure, and manufacturing. And together, they represent approximately 10 million tons of annual steel demand. Secondly, as our member companies specify their procurement requirements and what data they need from suppliers, it enables proactive collaboration and response from the supply chain. And I will share some case studies about that in the next few slides. And then by unifying the collective demand from our members, we have had more success with engaging policymakers and presenting the case for scaling policy support to speed up the net zero transition. So here are some examples of how our Steel Zero members are leading the way in collaborating with their suppliers to meet their Steel Zero procurement commitments. We have Swedish steelmaker SSAB providing fossil-free and recycled steel to Volvo Cars for selected components in their upcoming fully electric SUV. And Ørsted has also partnered with its German steel supplier Dillinger to secure future supplies of lower emission steel for its offshore wind projects. Siemens Gamesa are playing their role as well in building industrial ecosystems within their supply chain in the wind energy infrastructure sector. So earlier this year, Siemens Gamesa gathered their key suppliers, customers, and policymakers in Germany, discussing the important synergies between the energy transition and the requirements for green steel in building that infrastructure. And we were as well invited to participate in this forum. And as a real case example, Siemens Gamesa have also manufactured a range of greener tower and supplied it to their customer RWE for an offshore wind project in Denmark. And these greener tower use steel plates with lower emissions in them, and they will help cut the carbon footprint of the entire turbine by 20%. SKF have also worked with their supplier Voestalpine for the first hydrogen-reduced steel used in its prototype bearing. And this is another example of a leading company partnering with their supplier over many, many years of collaboration to deliver something innovative and on the path to a net zero future. This achievement is not only a technical breakthrough, but also an example of how Steel Zero members are driving the net zero steel transition. Next, demand-side companies have a very important role to play in driving data disclosures and transparency from the steel industry as well. Our Steel Zero members worked with us to develop a progress reporting framework, and this is the first instance of a demand-led framework to set the requirements and ask for data from steel suppliers in a unified and consistent way. Through this, our members gather data annually from their supply chain and assess the progress of the steel that they use. This information then helps them shape their future procurement specifications as well. And then through more supplier expectations to share data, our members are having a market influence in improving transparency. Now, steelmakers are increasingly recognizing that their customers want to know about the steel that they are buying, especially what its carbon footprint is. The role we are playing is amplifying our members' efforts into widespread industry action. We collect the information from our members' reporting experiences with suppliers and analyze it to have a clear understanding of the gaps that we have in data, which there are plenty of, and the challenges currently in disclosing it. And this way, we can then communicate the overall demand requirements to the steel suppliers, and we can also build it into our policy work to drive greater data sharing. And it's not a role we play alone, as we are part of multi-stakeholder forums, like Amy mentioned, which is the Steel Standards Principles, and Amy also spoke about the role of interoperability between standards and the importance of data assurance and verification in that. So we have been involved in these forums as well, along with 20 leading steelmakers, iron and steel federations from Japan and China, World Steel Association, Responsible Steel, and several other initiatives also part of this same forum. And here we're driving action for improved data disclosure and transparency through what experiences we are bringing from the demand side. And some of the ongoing developments that we have includes setting up a common reporting boundary and common data points that steelmakers can, going forward, share with customers. So in summary here, we enable demand-side leadership by providing the frameworks, the tools and guidance, and the advocacy channels that allow demand-side members to turn their ambition into action. SteelZero is also a platform that empowers members to shape policy and advocacy messages that we represent on their behalf. Together with our members, we published the first ever global policy principles to speed up the net zero transition, and this has been the basis of a lot of our policy messages that we have worked on with different regional governments. And one example of how we're ramping up market-specific policy work with our members is in the UK. We have 26 members in the UK, and they represent the whole breadth of the construction supply chain downstream from steel producers, so that is from fabricators to contractors, developers, and even engineering consultants. And this has given us the influence with the UK government to drive the demand side's policy needs with them. This year, especially and extensively, we have been part of several discussions with our members and the UK government that has led to the ongoing developments on the UK steel strategy and the policy framework for low-carbon industrial materials that's going to be coming out early next year. And these frameworks do touch upon a lot of the points that Responsible Steel spoke about around how governments can adopt clear standards in their policymaking and steel strategies as well. Then leading the global steel decarbonization through shaping policy, it is a core aim of our SteelZero initiative. And we want to bring this work and this level of influence to policy developments in Japan as well. So there's a real opportunity here for Japanese businesses to join our network and help us shape policy proposals for an effective, supportive policy landscape to drive the net zero steel transition in Japan. So what does all of this mean to you here in Japan? Japanese steel users have a very important role in influencing the pace and scale of the net zero steel transition. You can drive the level of ambition needed for the steel transition, and you can do this by clearly articulating what green steel is for you as buyers. That is, what level of carbon reduction do you want to see achieved, and what will you be willing to buy? And this is important so buyers can collectively define the green steel needs in Japan. You can help drive accountability in the steel industry. As buyers specify what they need from producers, you are setting the requirements on what green steel you're willing to buy. At the same time, to help ensure you are getting what you need, you can also request and require data disclosure from producers. And this is important for buyers to continue to call for greater data transparency to help your decision making. You can drive accessibility to the type of green steel you require. So the collective demand voice is a crucial stakeholder voice in all market-making discussions. And it is important for governments and the industry to hear from buyers. And you can drive availability. As I shared with the case studies earlier, buyers that set targets and make commitments to procure lower emission steel engage and collaborate extensively with their supply chain. And this is what drives future availability of green steel. So in conclusion, here is the important role of the Steel Zero Demand Initiative in creating and transforming the market for net zero steel. To drive ambition, we have shaped the market. We have a global definition. And next, we are working with Japanese users to shape what the best-in-class procurement practices would look like here. So we call on you to join our network and work with us in shaping the lower emission steel market in Japan. Through implementation, we can drive accountability. We have worked with our demand-side members to develop tools for data requests, and we are working with World Steel and other industry bodies to develop standardized data forms. And we will also work with users and stakeholders here in Japan to build best practices on tracking supply chain data. We scale our work to drive accessibility, and this is an exciting time because Japan is a priority area for us this year and in 2026. And so we are going to be forming our core proposals to shape policy developments here in Japan so that this enables the availability and use of genuinely lower emission steel. For this, we are engaged with policymakers here in Japan, especially to share the challenges and needs of steel users and to advocate for supportive market policies. So Japanese businesses can work with us to shape policy that works for you. And through all of this and all our collective efforts, we will transform the market and drive up availability of truly decarbonized steel in Japan. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Samin, do you have? Okay. Yeah. Okay. ありがとうございました.
Thank you very much indeed. Steel Zero, the RE100 Climate Group, they have a similar philosophy. I think it is an initiative that shares the philosophies. In the case of RE100, Japan has the second largest number of members in RE100. And in the case of Steel Zero, I am sure that there will be a large number of Japanese entities, but it is not long since the start of the activities here in Japan. And therefore, I believe you have engaged with Japanese stakeholders compared to RE100, compared to what you see in Europe. What is your observation about Japan's response, reaction, and Japan's demand side? Have you observed any difference between Japan and other countries? Or if you have any advices or ideas of what you want to do for Japan, please?
Yes, that is a very interesting question. I think the greatest observation that I have had, which is unique to Japan, is how supportive or how the industry, the steel industry here in Japan and the government is really coming together to have a common vision through the GX transformation program. And of course, this has its own developments in green steel as well for GX that is pushed for by or developed by the Japan Iron and Steel Federation and supported by METI. So that kind of interaction is very unique to Japan, and we haven't seen this very close integration in a lot of other countries. It is emerging now, but the speed at which it has emerged in Japan is unique. Now, that does also pose its challenges because there are a lot of market-enabling discussions we need to have. There's a lot of demand side that needs to also be involved in the way the market is shaped. And that's the philosophy that we bring as Steel Zero is having demand side as a key stakeholder in shaping that market. And so that is what going forward we want to be seeing more of here in Japan is how the buyers can be integrated into shaping the market for net zero steel here in Japan.
Thank you. ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Samin. So this was a session 1. Agora Industry, Responsible Steel, and Climate Group have presented to us. They welcome questions, feedback, any comments. You have the email information, and Samin is with us, as well as William. They are physically present, so you have the opportunity to talk directly. Having said that, thank you for your attention, and we go on to session 2. Next will be about the decarbonization of the steel industry in Japan. Yuko Nishida of our institute will present. She is leading the decarbonization of the industry. In particular, when it comes to iron and steel decarbonization, she has long been engaged in the R&D. Nishida-san. Thank you very much. I am Nishida of the Renewable Energy Institute. I will discuss briefly about the situation in Japan. Looking at the world and Japan, I prepared this graph. CO2 emission trend is shown. So this is the iron and steel sector in Japan. The orange line shows the trend of the CO2 emission compared to the world. And 2019 and 2023, and it is minus 15% compared to the world trend. Japan looks like steadily reducing the emission. However, the production is also shown on the same graph, and the production change seems to be the major factor of the reduction in the emission. Again, Wido prepared a similar graph, and I copied. Japan's sector and the 2030 target for the sector is, compared to fiscal 2013, 30% reduction. That is the goal of the Japanese sector goal. And what is it like as of now? Up to 2023, it was almost a 30% reduction achieved, and almost 30% goal might have been achieved already. However, as was mentioned, it is largely due to the production down, and intensity is down by 8%. However, the key is going forward. Between 2030 to 2050, the reduction target is still very huge, and we have to think about beyond 2030. 2030 goal might be too lax, some might say. However, at this moment, going beyond the 2030 and looking through to 2050, we have to continue the reduction until we reach net zero. Then, rather than 2035, we had to think about 2035, 2040, and there must be specific targets for beyond 2030. As the NDC, the government of Japan has released the 2040 NDC. In order to achieve the 1.5 degrees, the government claims that it is in alignment with the 1.5 degrees target. But then, what is the goal of the steel sector? The industry target is going to be very important. So the industry target is crucial. And near zero emission production is another important factor. In order to achieve net zero by 2050, the production facilities have to transform. If they are in operation by 2050, those are supposed to be near zero emission production facility, and that should be in operation by 2050. But in Japan, that has not been achieved yet. At the moment, the route and the technology envisioned in Japan, these are the three main production pathways. The left is the BF, BOF, and to introduce hydrogen so that even using blast furnace, hydrogen to be reduced. Under this technology, it does not go to zero. Emission will not go to zero, which means the CCS must be combined. In the middle, this was mentioned by Guido, and this might be the global trend. This is direct reduced iron, and in particular, hydrogen-based DRI. This production pathway, we think that this is the closest to near zero emission technology, and this could play the protagonist role. If the blast furnace continues to be utilized, yes, there is CCC and it's okay, you might say, but not only the blast furnace, but for the sintering or the cokes, there are so many areas where CO2 are emitted, and the CCS alone will not be able to close the gap. And not only economic risk, but the CCS itself does have the risk. Therefore, the left-hand side diagram, in the future, we know that this cannot reach near zero. We think this is only a transitional technology. Then in the middle, that is the hydrogen-based DRI, and pushing this pathway probably is important. In addition to that, electric arc furnace, scrap-based EAF is also extremely important. Even as of now, scrap-based production is expanding, and the blast furnace makers have to be replaced with scrap, or the quality has to be improved. And the middle route, which is hydrogen-based DRI, and that produces the DRI. And using that DRI to produce steel, that would become necessary. And which technology will achieve near zero emission? And looking at the emission, this is the information. On the left-hand side, that is the blast furnace and the electric arc furnace, which is the current situation. And out of the blast furnace, to reduce hydrogen and combine CCS, the red line is the necessary level to be achieved, but that cannot be achieved. And in the middle, the circle in the middle, that is the DRI based on hydrogen. In the case of hydrogen-based DRI, like the green axis, 70% hydrogen will come close to near zero emission. However, first, the use of gas is being promoted. So first use the gas and gradually replace it with hydrogen is the plan. In the case of gas, only 50% reduction is achieved, and therefore gas-based DRI, that still only leads us to halfway. And the three pathways are put it into a table. What might be the potential and what are the challenges of Japan? On the left, use of CCS, that's quite challenging. In the middle, in the case of DRI, how to make hydrogen available is a challenge. And the scrap-based electric arc furnace, that sounds fine, but the scrap availability is also limited all over the world. As Guido told us, only about 50%. Because of the raw material supply, we can only supply 50% of the scrap for the required amount. And about the decarbonized electricity, or almost 100% renewable electricity, how to make that available is also a challenge. Those would be the important aspects, and transition plans also have to be considered. And in the middle, the pathway, the hydrogen-based DRI, which is expected to be the protagonist in Japan, decarbonized hydrogen, green hydrogen availability will be the challenge. So looking at the upstream alone and the production of reduced iron, that to cut that out and to produce it elsewhere could be a way. And looking at Japan's challenge and hydrogen availability, hydrogen is very expensive in Japan, as the graph clearly shows. It's not only expensive at the moment, but it is expected to continue to be expensive, and importing is also expensive. Import cost of hydrogen, it's really expensive. And therefore, how to think about the cost of using hydrogen. Doing all in Japan when it is so expensive would not be realistic, and how to secure renewable electricity, renewable energy. Regarding renewable energy power, it's not only important for DRI based on hydrogen, but the post-process using the electric arc furnace or in the production of products. Electricity is important, and therefore how to ensure sufficient renewable electricity. That is a major challenge going forward. However, at least in the upstream, at the reduction process, in the places where renewable energy is fully available, that seems to be a realistic solution. And another challenge, a major challenge that Japan is facing, that is about CCS. If the blast furnace is going to be continued to be used, the CCS will be a requirement. No matter how hard we spread the use of CCS, we can't reach a zero emission. In terms of transition policy, some people say that CCS will have to be utilized. However, in Japan, after all, yes, there are CCS projects ongoing. The government has supported 9 CCS projects, and 4 out of the 9, that is to export them to other countries, which means very expensive. Or the management, it will be very difficult and challenging and not quite easy.
So, the possibility of near zero emission in Japan, at this point in time, what is the most promising? I would like to investigate this question. So from a blast furnace to major EAF, there is a project to make a shift. Some steel making a company is indicating this. The government has provided so much subsidy, and Nippon Steels, Yawata, and JFE Steels, Kurashiki are working on these major projects. So these are highly promising, and I have high expectations for them. But as a raw material, reduced iron, of course, the scrap will be used, but reduced iron will be used for this purpose. So this reduced iron will be imported from abroad. That is the current plan. And now JFE Steel is looking at the Middle East. It is advancing its project in the Middle East. And currently they were saying they would use gas at the beginning. But in the end, the DRI will be produced and it will be brought back to Japan. So that's the plan for JFE. Now, these are initial developments. So in 2028, slightly before 2030, EAF will be operational. And regarding this project, we have high hopes and expectations. And gas will be used for this project. And as I said earlier, and as Wido said earlier, next, after 50% reduction is achieved, how can we replace the gas with hydrogen? So future transition to hydrogen is something that they have plans for. So we would like to monitor the situation with a high level of interest and expectation. And also, Wido and Isa talked about this already. Green steel supporting programs. So green steel can be produced and supplied, and the demand should be ramped up. And the policies are very important in this regard. So in that sense, the government of Japan is making every effort. So you can see the list of efforts they are making. So on the supply side, as I said earlier, for the EAF, there are subsidy programs. And also for the R&D activities, there are subsidy programs. And also for energy efficiency facilities, there are subsidy programs as well. And they are scaled subsidy programs. And on top of that, there are tax deductions and tax breaks. And also they have a condition that as long as hydrogen is used, price difference support is also available. So as a list, this is really a full list, I would say, a fully fledged list. But unfortunately, what I'm a little bit disappointed about is that in the earlier presentation, Wido said carbon pricing is very important, and also material efficiency and circular economy related policies are also very essential in my view. But regarding these aspects, I think policies are lagging behind. So if they can make it on time or in time would be an important question. So on the demand side, there are some policies as well. So the menu is very elaborate. For example, Green Purchase Act and government subsidies are available. Government subsidies have been somewhat effective, in my view. Having said that, going forward, there are still many actions that can be taken, and there are many actions that need to be taken. For example, life cycle carbon reduction for buildings and structures is one area where I hope to see more progress. And also, currently, the government support targets Japan's steel associations, GX Steel, ISF, GX Steel, mass balance and allocation. There are two methodologies here, as you can see at the top of the slide. So today I'm not going to elaborate on them too much, but this is the government LCA, carbon footprint guideline, will be developed by the government as well. So in case of Japan, these are recognized methods or will be recognized in Japan. Now, this GX Steel has some issues and challenges. On a continuous basis, we would like to monitor certain points about the GX Steel. So GX Steel will pool various reductions here and there, and then they can be allocated to products. That is the methodology here. So this is really a transition measure. So when it comes to the large-scale EAFs, by 2030 or 2035, they will be available. So by then, they should expire. And of course, appropriateness of reduction projects have to be looked at, and how to verify and validate that is important. And what's most important is that GX Steel scheme should be transparent and traceable. So the reliability of the scheme has to be secured and ensured. We have to continuously monitor these aspects regarding GX Steel. So from the responsible steel, there was a mention about the evaluation and assessment. In case of Japan, even today regarding GX Steel, they are saying that this will be allowed, but what is the appropriate level? What about the intensity? How much intensity is considered green, and what are the trends and developments? And what's important here is that when scrap steel is introduced or incorporated, then scrap steel in the first place is quite low emissions, so the standards should change. That is the argument and case by Responsible Steel and others when they talk about their assessment standards. So are we going to incorporate that sort of aspect of scrap steel? This kind of a cost post GX steel labeling system has to be considered already. We have to start considering that already now. So we have to make sure of these points. Otherwise, yes, we work on GX steel, but we have no exit strategy. That's not going to be an ideal situation. Finally, the actions we should be taking right now, the order is random. First, eyeing a near zero emission, we should formulate a mid to long-term strategy. Now, GX steel included, how to work with BFs and also primary steel. There is a high level of interest, and there are a lot of policies available. And regarding EAFs and also scrap steel, how to utilize them, that is also another aspect we should look at. So comprehensive policy making is necessary. And more than anything, we have to realize near zero emission projects, DRI projects, have to be implemented, for example, outside of Japan, and we need to promote them, and also major EAFs will be introduced in the end. If that's the case, then as an ingredient or material, DRI will be necessary. So BF originated steel should not be introduced in these projects. So we should draw a clear line here, and we have to do elaborate a follow-up. And not just a hydrogen DRI, but also we have to promote the transition to hydrogen as well. Also, as I said earlier, real green steel products demand has to be expanded. This is something we have to make steady progress on. There are a lot of policy menus for support, and we will discuss that in the panel discussion session. There are many measures for the expansion. There are many obstacles in each area. So we have to check and verify each and every one of them. And GX steel has to be harmonized in terms of Japan and overseas assessment standards. And last but not least, going forward for the industries of Japan as a whole have to tackle the electrification challenge. If that's the case, including cost, natural energy, renewable energy, power will be most promising, so we have to include that in our consideration and implement actions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Going on to session 3, the panel discussion. We are slightly behind schedule. Originally, we were planning to have 20 minutes, and we would like to spend 20 minutes, and therefore we will go slightly beyond 5 p.m. So we will look at how to ensure decarbonization of the steel sector in Japan and how the demand side can cause the change. And we would like to discuss both from the practice and the policy side, and introducing the panelist from Japan Climate Leaders Partnership, JCLP, advisor Mr. Ishida. JCLP is a network of businesses launched in Japan, including companies leading climate actions and renewable procurement and decarbonization. Supply chain are discussed, and they are supporting the companies. And on the demand side, many of the companies are also members of this JCLP, which is a characteristic. And from her climate group, we have Ms. Samin, and the moderator is Ms. Nishida of our institute. I am aware of the time, but we did have excellent presentations, and we did not want to cut the presentation short, so please kindly bear with us. So we have heard about the global situations and looked at the Japanese situation, and here we would like to look at the transition period and how the end users should adapt. We have Mr. Ishida and Ms. Khan. We are in a transition, and finally, the near zero emission steel finally seems to become available. The production might start in order to allow us to achieve net zero. The first plant is either under construction or it is important that the actual investment in entities start, and which means that there must be a demand in the first place, which means that the end user is expected to play an important role. In the community of architecture, Ishida-san, Dr. Ishida has been leading the issue of sustainability. I have also been engaged deeply in construction and architecture. When the two of us get together, we tend to stick to architecture and construction only, and we might go out of control with our dedication to architecture and construction, but we might really focus on buildings and construction because of the background. So first asking Dr. Ishida, at the moment, the end users of iron and steel, what are the situation of the end users at this moment? Thank you very much. As was introduced, indeed, I am in the architecture and construction industry, and I might look as if I represent the end user side, but I will have to talk about the construction sector. First, the sense as an end user. The general contractors, we spoke with general contractors, the construction companies. They are contractor business, and therefore from the owner of the project, if there is a request for low carbon steel, there must be an order in the first place. Otherwise, the contractor cannot select a particular steel on their own volition. That I understand. However, in the specification, if it is says blast furnace, many of the specifications still include a blast furnace. As I speak with contractors, just because it was printed BF, it is not changed. Simply, it was BF from the past, so no one dared to change. And I think that could be changed. And then, on the owner of the project who places the order to the contractor, those would be the leading developers of construction, and I talk with them. And the CO2 emission during construction, but the calculation is not defined, and therefore, even if a low carbon steel is purchased for the construction, in the scope 3, it cannot be reflected into scope 1, 2, and 3 of their own calculation, and there is not much merit even if they purchase expensive low carbon steel. But now calculation is being developed and becoming aligned, and therefore low carbon steel purchase is starting to attract attention at last. In the decision of purchase, what might be additional barriers? And this might be a Japanese way of thinking. But the tenant of the building, that there are many blast furnace companies who are the tenant, and so that they don't want to force other than blast furnace technology. And the developers and the general contractors and the power balance compared with the steel makers. The power balance, it's like a food chain, and the top predator we thought was the developer, but that seems not to be the case. The supply-demand balance is one force, and you have to find the general contractor, and the general contractor must ensure the supply, purchase of the materials, because materials are becoming expensive, And all parties are having difficulty, and therefore the developer is not necessarily the strongest in the food chain, so to say. And there seems to be quite a lot of challenges or barriers, more than I had expected. Thank you. I'm not a manufacturer of buildings, but...
So now, looking at the Samin, already you are speaking to some Japanese demand-side companies. So green steel that they are already receiving or using, how are they using the green steel? Could you please talk about the Japanese demand companies using green steel? What are they using green steel for and what not?
Yeah. Yes, from the conversations that we've been having here in Japan, it's still very new in early stages of development. There is not a lot of demand for green steel right now, which is what we want to tackle because we want to see what is needed for the demand side, for them to have confidence, for them to have information on what is available in Japan. So from what we have noticed through our conversations, first and foremost, we found that information is key. So to gain awareness about embodied carbon conditions and considerations for steel in Japan, that is important. And Ishida-san has been speaking about calculations and the need for all of that, the framework around that to develop robustly, because then that will help the demand side to be able to take a decision on what green steel means for them and what they want to be procuring, and then how to start speaking to supply chain about that. The other very important thing is forums like this as well for information sharing. So the more often we host convenings and seminars and platforms for knowledge exchange, like over here, is also a really good way to help build that information. So we have to start with that and then start to help create the market. And then eventually green steel will become a demand as well. Yeah.
Considering this circumstance, why difficult to purchase green steel? I would be keen to know more about the assessment and evaluation. It has not been established yet, or ambiguous, or the assessment evaluation method is not yet established, or the method might not be developed. In the first place, Dr. Ishida, it applies not only to construction, but it applies to many other sectors. Category, why companies would want to choose to use a low-carbon material, that is, they want to reflect the use of low-carbon material into their corporate actions. How to calculate across Japan? We are talking about going GX, but without the combination between GX and DX, it may not be successful. So a certain material is purchased, and how smaller is carbon footprint? How to find that out? Within JCLP partnership, we do discuss this. Even if you purchase, then what about the third-party assurance? Is this assured by an independent third party? There will be questions asked. And then to the supplier, you also have to ask, are you assured? And the second-tier, third-tier suppliers all will be asked if you are assured by a third party. And unless you have an established system or a framework, you do not get to the answer. So you can't overcome this barrier with a moderate effort. And this is a challenge related to database, because database tend to be costly and expensive. I mean, the database itself is expensive to access, to register, and like an input-output table. If there is a free of charge information or data, it will not be easy. My colleague at the Renewable Energy Institute, and in the United States, LCA calculation in the US has been studied by my colleague. And at the stage of design, whether it be engineer, they check, and this H steel bar, when that is chosen, could there be a replacement by a lower emission steel, for example, within the design tool, within the PC? If you can click and find, let's say, compare green steel and which company is which green steel, or green cement made by which company. And if you use this particular green cement, then the carbon footprint or emission goes down in this way by just click on the PC. If that kind of system becomes available, then it would become easier to choose such greener product. In Japan, we are still discussing about undefined definition, or some industries do not trust particular definitions. Different stakeholders cannot agree on definitions. We are stuck there. But also using DX, digital and green transition, how we can advance, I think, will be important. And Samin, how to access information is important. Information is key. And using digitalization technology, how to enable users to access and how to encourage users to utilize the information.
Yes, digitalization and access to information will indeed be very important for the end users, but we have to take a few steps back first and speak to the points that was raised in the presentations earlier about what are you setting as the common boundary for definitions or for accounting rules or for standards that methodologies that first need to be followed to calculate the emissions intensity or calculate the data that would then be shared with the digital in a digital framework downstream. So I think taking those steps back, that is what is first needed in Japan as well. Specifically, are there rules around carbon emissions intensity? Of course, we know that there is a framework that's guidelines being developed here for steel industry, but how aligned is that with global frameworks as well? That's another thing to look at, because you have a lot of global supply chains, a lot of global customers using Japanese steel, and a lot of global customers working with Japanese downstream supply chain partners. So having that global harmonization is also very important here in Japan. So I think the first steps would be, what can the steel industry and what can the government do to set up the robustness of the methodologies and the accounting rules. Mm-hmm. And then once we have that, of course, on the side, development of a digital framework for passing down the information can always come up. But if that information is not good enough, what passes through the framework would not be sufficient. Mm-hmm.
Another point regarding green steel, it is difficult to buy green steel because of cost, because it's expensive. So currently all the construction materials are very expensive. So if they are so expensive, we cannot afford them. If someone says that to you, how would you respond, Ishida-san? Well, thank you very much. So JCLP tends to be approached by businesses. So sometimes the JCLP businesses may buy green steel even if it's expensive, but that's not what we are saying. So I'm in the construction area. So during the construction, CO2 emissions are calculated on our side. And when I look at the calculation results, out of the construction process, more than 50% comes from concrete and iron. So for construction parts, sometimes iron and so on are included, but if you exclude that, there are some steel materials that are easy to understand. 1/3 of the emissions come from iron or steel, 33% to be precise. But if you look at the cost only, it is only 12 to 13%. So if the iron or steel price goes up by 10%, even with a 10% increase for the entire building cost, the increase is only 1 to 2%. So the impact is actually quite limited. So if the cost becomes twice overall, then the impact is too large. But if the increase is only 10 to 20%, it's not so much, in my opinion. So I believe that there is this misunderstanding or misconception. So when we ask people, they say that even slight increase is something they don't like. But EAF manufacturers, some of them have power certificates or credits, and using all these options, they have pretty much a zero emission steel. So the cost increase here is not so much, less than 10%. So by utilizing all these tools, it is achievable. So without seeing the cost increase of 10%, it is possible to cut the steel by 1/3. So I believe that there is a solution, but that is not widely known. So we need to share this information that the solutions are available. So how to spread such information is probably part of our responsibility.
Electric arc furnace is one option, but that is not the only answer. And where the green steel can be utilized, in what way, that is an area where it has to be considered in a strategic manner. And by thinking in a strategic manner, the overall cost can be controlled and managed. That, I think, is absolutely necessary. And the fact or the perception that green steel is expensive, if you just stop because green steel is expensive, we will go nowhere. We will need policies and other support measures. And that we would like to continue to think about. And on the side of the buyer, schemes are moving, and who is going to place the order for what kind of material, and the definition of the green steel and the cost, the expensive price will be mentioned first. But there are many other challenges to utilize the green steel. Ishida-san? I seem to be talking about all the problems only. But I think the business practices also could be one reason. Iron and steel, the general contractors will ask for a low carbon steel, and they say, yes, yes, we can sell you this. It's not so easy. There are commissioners and steel works and trading houses, lots of intermediaries. When buildings are constructed, even if the general contractor says they want a particular kind of steel, the response will be, we are not sure if we can supply that, and there is a delivery timeline. So to purchase on time is going to be critical. So that's another difficulty. Even if you ask for a particular steel, it's not easy to purchase, and there is also cultural background in Japan. For example, this is about zero-emission steel. For the small and medium-sized general contractors, and I encourage the president of a company, if you make a commitment now, you will be the #1 in the small and medium maker. And the response was, are the larger companies making that commitment? And I said, not yet. The larger general contractors cannot make a commitment, and then we, SME general contractor, cannot make such a commitment first. We can't stick out, they tell me. And the electric wires, for example, for the mega solar projects, wires preferably should be low carbon wires, and there was an entity who tried to make low carbon wire steels, and the larger wire steel makers, are they making low carbon product? No. Then the SME company cannot go first. They can't stick out. SME wire maker cannot go first ahead of larger companies. So the entire people in the Japanese culture, they tend to think about what the larger companies are doing first. So which means that the larger entities will have to go first. So JCLP members, you have to go first, yes, because the Japanese entities tend not to want to stick out.
So Ishida-san has just explained is very important. In case of Japan, there is RE100, which is gathering momentum. And going forward, Steel Zero is an area where we have to make a concerted efforts, and everyone committing to this, not just the definition. Cost is also important, but apart from these areas, we have to identify challenges and where we might be able to see a progress. We have to think about all these questions. And when doing so, Steel Zero commitment can be useful vehicle. So I believe that this will be a very sort of convenient approach. What do you think, Asamin?
Yeah, yes, definitely it will be convenient if there were more commitments that aligned with the Steel Zero framework, because then that will give very, very clear indication in the market here what is the quantitative definition for green steel that buyers want to look for, and how to then procure and specify that in future contracts, and how to then ask suppliers for information about it and engage with suppliers as well to be future ready. So this all kind of helps put that framework together. And then not only that, also on, as I mentioned on the policy side, is how the market can be created in Japan. The market is being created, but without the demand side voice and without the clear definition. So this is where, along with Steel Zero, we can bring in the demand into creating the clear definitions and the clear asks for what green steel will be in Japan.
And Ishida-san, maybe your final comment? The commitment to declare Steel Zero, as was mentioned, just like RE100, the end users have to send out the signal to encourage commitment to Steel Zero. In the case of Japan, yes, it is true that Japanese entities are signing up for RE100, and the Japanese people are so serious. So when they make a commitment, they want to be certain that they can achieve. Until they are certain, they don't want to make a public commitment. And we have been referring to RE100 and Steel Zero, but we do want to achieve Steel Zero. It is about the commitment to want to achieve. So sending out a message that the Japanese entities are aspiring to or wishing to achieve zero emission in steel, I would want to see many more entities to commit. And whether they can achieve or not, that's another issue. That's an issue for Japan as a whole. It's not that 100% of the risk should be borne by one single entity that made a commitment. That is my personal feeling. In the case of RE100, when I was with my company, our company made a commitment to RE100, and we were not at all certain whether we can achieve. We just said we are going to declare. We just declared we want to go RE100, and we convinced our president. We weren't at all certain whether it was really achievable for our entity. In the experience of RE100, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, and the Ministry of Environment are ambassadors, and they have made a commitment. So in the case of committing for Steel Zero, if Japan is serious, METI and MLIT, Ministry of Land Infrastructure and Transportation, ministries should first make their commitment. And in the bidding and the buildings to be constructed by their own ministry, the steel to be procured for government construction, that should be in alignment with Steel Zero commitment. Then I think the demand will shoot up. So that is my request to the government of Japan. Thank you very much.
So we join and we may not be able to achieve, but even if you do not join, there should be a mechanism that you can achieve. Such an environment needs to be established. I believe that is our mission. So today, thank you very much for your participation. My thanks go to the two panelists. Thank you so much. Ishida-san, Asami-san, Nishida-san, thank you very much to three of you. So today's seminar offered the entire picture of decarbonized steel and what sort of actions will be necessary for the demand side to bring about changes. I hope that today's seminar will further support the demand of a low-carbon steel going forward, and as was mentioned by Ishida-san, Japan's steel-making industry should be able to just not just follow or keep up with the trend, but also it should be able to carve out such new trends. And I'd like to introduce the next event of the Institute on the 25th of November. We will hold a seminar with a theme on understanding the GHG protocol revision on the 25th of November. So I hope that all businesses who are here today will be able to attend once again, because this is about critical changes about international accounting and reporting rules, which will directly contribute to the emissions reduction on your side. And also, Institute offers podcast programs showcasing the initiatives of our researchers as well. So if you could enjoy them, that would be appreciated as well. So if you are participating online, thank you very much for spending so much time with us. And also to in-person participants, there will be a networking and reception opportunity immediately after this seminar. So in the foyer, out of this conference room, you can continue your discussions. Thank you very much for your participation today.